Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Well, after months of Brexit sucking up all the energy in Westminster, 6 senior MPs who chair cross-party committees warned Theresa May at the weekend that prolonged arguments over Brexit are having a serious detrimental effect on wider domestic policy. Among the many vital bills being delayed, one on domestic abuse, which will enshrine in law a definition of the offence. In a moment, our social affairs editor looks at the difficulties of investigating complex domestic violence cases. But first, in Birmingham today, a man has been given a life sentence after pleading guilty to murdering his ex-partner and her mother. Jane Dodge reports.
She fled the violence in Syria for a new life in Britain, joining her mother in Solihull. But it proved to be no sanctuary for either Raneem Ouda or her mother, Khawla Salim. Their family still in a state of disbelief about their deaths.
When you look at her, you think of life, full of life.
You remember the good memories on the day, and then later on the day you find that they're not there anymore, you know.
Jambaz Tareen married Raneem under Islamic law after they met at college, later telling her, "When I saw you, I said, this is mine." Raneem left him after he became violent, and she discovered he was already married with a wife and children in Afghanistan. On the night of the murders, Raneem, now without her headscarf, and her mother had gone to a shisha lounge. Jambaz Tareen had followed them. Police say he was hunting them down. CCTV footage shows him pointing his finger at Raneem, then following her into the lounge where he continues to argue with her and her mother. There's a further altercation between him and Mrs. Salim before the women decide to leave, closely followed by Tareen, who is escorted out by staff after threatening to kill his wife. Raneem then comes back to the reception and phones 999. Later that night, Tareen is seen in a white van on his way to the family home. He's then shown running. Moments later, he stabs the 2 women to death. The next day, he's caught on CCTV in a chicken shop. He's shaved off his beard and changed his clothes. Jambaz Tareen is finally arrested 3 days later after a tip-off from a member of the public. He's been pepper-sprayed by police. Mrs. Salim had tried to protect her daughter, first with a court order against Tareen, then with her life. Her sister says the police should have done more.
Raneem, for months and months, she would call the police number of occasions to tell them about him, and then even the neighbour has reported him many times.
The police have described that contact as low level, but the case is now being investigated by the Independent Office for Police Conduct.
The matter's been referred to the IOPC. They'll have a look at it, and as always in these cases, if there's stuff to learn, we will learn it.
Jambaz Tareen has been sentenced to a minimum of 32 years in prison. The police say he has never once shown any remorse.
Now, it's a horrifying statistic. A woman is killed by her male partner or former partner every 4 days in England and Wales. Channel 4 News has seen new figures that reveal the number of deaths linked to domestic violence is on the rise. The findings for 2017 show that at least 139 women were killed by men in 2017. 46% of those were killed by their current or former partner, and 55% of them were killed within a month of separating. But the charity Women's Aid, who compiled this data, say the real figure could be much higher. They say more weight should be given to any history of domestic violence in unexplained deaths or suicides. In the first of a series of reports this week examining domestic violence, our social affairs editor Jackie Long has been talking to one family whose daughter died following an abusive relationship. And just to warn you, some may find some details in her report distressing.
Immortalised in mementos and old pictures, remembered in much repeated stories. Katie Wilding was just 21 when she died.
This was the start of the selfies where they all did the pouch, and that was taken in their IT class.
For her mother and sisters, one story is still painful to tell.
One day she came home and said, "Oh, I've seen a man I quite like. He's tall, he's dark, he's handsome." And she'd met him at a sandwich bar, of all places. I think she was quite smitten.
Initially, when Julie Onger's daughter Katie met Mitchell Richardson, Julie's only worry was the age gap. Katie was 19, her new boyfriend 31. But within weeks there was a creeping sense of concern about other things, she says. As well as having a problem with drink and drugs, he quickly became controlling.
Within about 3 weeks he'd moved in. Just the control seemed to be a problem. She wasn't sort of seeing so much of her friends because he was there, and her friends stopped going round because he was there.
His control moved to outright aggression, says Julie, though Katie didn't always see it that way.
She would never say he'd hit her, but he'd slap her, he'd spit at her, he'd pull her hair, he'd hold her down on the bed. They seemed to work when he wanted it to, but then he would become aggressive and violent again, and it would go back to the beginning, but then he would work really hard to say, I love you, I'm sorry.
In the month leading up to Katie's death, Mitchell was arrested twice. He was charged with 2 counts of common assault against Katie and criminal damage to her property.
She would make a lot of excuses and even
cancel meetings with us. Yeah.
And what was that like as her sisters?
Really tough, because she's our baby sister, so we felt like we were supposed to protect her. So
and we did it.
You did.
Julie accepts Katie had also taken drugs during the relationship and had sought help from her GP, although her mother insists she was not a regular user. One day there was a knock at Julie's door. Although Katie had left Mitchell, the pair had been found dead at his flat of an overdose.
I opened the door and there was a policeman stood, and I knew. And he said to me, "Are you Julie?" I said, "Yes." And I said, what's he done to her?
But you weren't surprised when the policeman told you that she had died?
He'd phoned me and told me to smash Katie's phone. This is the day after he'd been arrested for the first time. Smash Katie's phone, and if I didn't, something terrible would happen to Katie. And when I said what, he said, "Oh, the police will be involved." And there was another phone call where he said, "I'm going to kill her with drugs and you'll never prove it."
Mitchell's family told us that claim is fabricated and unsubstantiated. Police have no record Julie Onjor reported it. The family believe there was a third party present that evening, and they said the couple had their respective issues, but they were in love. Though an inquest ruled both had died of drugs, the circumstances and motive were unclear. A complaint by Julie that police officers investigating the deaths had made assumptions and weren't aware of all the evidence was upheld by the force. Crucially, Julie says they didn't give enough weight to the history of domestic violence.
She had a panic alarm fitted at her flat. The police believed she was high risk. The multi-agencies believed she was high risk. You know, these things need to be taken seriously, and we just feel that it was treated as a drugs case and not worth bothering.
Like her life didn't matter.
Campaigners are now fighting to help Julie get a domestic homicide review, a review into deaths where domestic violence is or appears to have been a factor.
Katie was vulnerable. She was 21. She was perceived by the Multi-Agency Risk Assessment Conference just 1 month before as being at high risk of domestic abuse from the person with whom she was found dead 1 month later. The domestic homicide review is much deeper and broader than anything that's happened before. It's not a blame environment, it's about inviting people, emancipating them if you like, to come to the table and say, how could we have prevented this? And if we don't think we could, how could we prevent the next one? How can we make the area safer, which, by the way, is our statutory responsibility.
The pain of losing a child is unbearable. What's kept me going is that this should never happen to another family again.
It just breaks your heart all the time.
But it makes you play the what-if game.
Yeah, you go over everything, you know, what could you have done differently? Or how could you have saved her?
We talk about her all the time because it keeps her alive. She'll always be 21. She'll always be beautiful.
But it's sad as well because you always think that you have forever and then you realise you don't.
Well, a Home Office spokesperson has just told us that they've made it a statutory duty for community safety partnerships to produce a domestic homicide review to ensure lessons are learned from those who are murdered by family or those close to them. Joining me now is Katie Ghosh, Chief Executive of Women's Aid, the organisation that produced those figures on femicide. Let's start with the domestic homicide review first. Are these reviews too hard to get hold of?
What we really want to see is the domestic homicide reviews, which happen locally in local areas, being brought together and looked at as a national picture so that we can really understand the patterns and the similarities and have more action being taken, as this courageous family members have been talking about, to prevent more femicides from happening.
And I mean, the scale of it is set out in your figures. I mean, that awful statistic that, you know, a male partner or former partner kills a woman in England and Wales every 4 days. I mean, is that the true scale of it? Or is this still a hidden crime and it's actually even worse than that?
Domestic abuse and all forms of violence and abuse against women and girls is still far too much in the shadows, and we need to bring it out into the open and tackle some of the stigma and the shame that people in relationships might find about talking about abuse. 139 women were killed by men in the UK last year. That's a minimum figure. There may be even more than that. We need every single victim or potential victim to get the right response from the police and the other agencies first time round, the first time they call out for help.
Well, that goes to the heart of the case we've been hearing about today. Terrible tragedy in Solihull, mother and her daughter killed by the daughter's ex-partner. I mean, she secured a non-molestation order there, and he flouted it. Are those orders fit for purpose?
No, and we see this time and time again. The government is going to be producing, we hope, a domestic abuse bill.
Delayed.
We need to see a delayed bill, but we hope to see that very soon. And we want to see a straightforward regime of orders. They need to be put in place, they need to be enforced, and there needs to be criminalisation of a breach of the order. That can be part of a femicide prevention strategy, but it can't be the whole thing.
I mean, the government has put 100 million quid into tackling domestic violence over, I think it's 2016 to 2020. Quite a small figure, but it is something. And, you know, Theresa May's talked about tackling burning injustices. Is the government's heart in this?
Well, pennies rather than pounds are currently spent on tackling violence against women and girls, so we need to see much more resources put in. We need to see the local services that are doing so much, that are doing life-saving work, be properly resourced, and that is part of preventing femicide in this country.
Katie Ghosh, thank you very much for joining us. And if you've been affected by any of the issues raised, you can call the National Domestic Violence Helpline on 0808 2000 247 24.
So what else has been stuck on the back burner whilst everyone in Westminster has been focused on Brexit? The NHS had to delay publishing its 10-year forward view, which was due earlier this month. That's now unlikely to come before New Year. A long-awaited green paper on the future of social care will also be delayed until January. And the government is at last expected to publish its white paper on post-Brexit immigration next week, after many weeks of delays.
Brexit has been called the bonfire of the sanities by those working in policy areas that are not getting the attention they would like. Last month, Theresa May had promised that the NHS long-term plan would give primary medical and community services more money from the overall NHS pot. But with the publication of the 10-year forward view now delayed until next year, it's unclear how much money these areas will actually get. A teaching union says schools and children's services have been hit too. The National Education Union says Dickensian poverty levels are becoming more prevalent. After surveying over 1,000 teachers, the union claims half of them believe children will go hungry this Christmas. 2/3 of teachers said more families couldn't afford adequate winter clothes and shoes compared to 3 years ago. A government spokesman said they'd introduced funding to support thousands of disadvantaged families in the school holidays.
And later in the programme, we'll have an exclusive report on the number of people dying whilst homeless and the failure to investigate many of those deaths.
I've been getting